Hey guys, here we are in DCS world, as always, and today we're going to talk about the 4 different types of airspeeds that are displayed in the cockpits of modern DCS world aircraft. We're going to define what these airspeeds are, how the aircraft generates them for you, the pilot, how they interact with each other, and more importantly the environment around your aircraft, and finally how you should utilize them while flying your aircraft on a training or combat sortie. For our example today, we are using the DCS F-14A 135GR, because the Tomcat displays these airspeeds in very distinct ways that will help illustrate the lesson for us today. But the lessons learned today will apply to all modern aircraft, from the Harrier to the Hornet to the Thunder and beyond. So let's hop in the cockpit and get started. Alright guys, we've got ourselves a beautiful morning over the deserts of the UAE and Oman to talk about the 4 different types of airspeeds that are displayed to you in the cockpit of a modern jet aircraft. First, we'll talk about where to actually find these 4 different distinct types of airspeeds in the cockpit of the F-14 Tomcat. Please keep in mind that whatever aircraft you choose to fly, all 4 of these airspeeds will be displayed to you in some form, whether on the HUD or on the instrument panel of your aircraft. In the F-14 Tomcat, the first and most simple type of airspeed, indicated airspeed, is on our airspeed indicator, but on the inside portion of the instrument face, as well as between the 12 o'clock and 4 o'clock positions on the outer portion of the instrument face. We can currently see in the small indicated airspeed window we're right at about 375 knots of indicated airspeed. The second type of airspeed we're going to talk about today is ground speed, and in the F-14 Tomcat that is displayed on the HSD. The third type of airspeed we're going to talk about today is true airspeed. That is also displayed as a digital readout on the HSD. The fourth type of airspeed that we're going to talk about today is our Mach number, and that is displayed on our airspeed indicator with our Mach meter being between the 4 o'clock and 12 o'clock positions on our airspeed indicator of the F-14 Tomcat. You'll notice that this kind of combined Mach meter and airspeed indicator will also be present in the upcoming Mirage F1. So let's go ahead and define these different types of airspeeds. Indicated airspeed is again inside of the instrument face of our F-14's airspeed indicator, is airspeed that is measured through the pitot-static system. In very simplistic terms, ram air is taken in through the pitot tube, which usually resides around the nose of modern fighter aircraft, and is then plumbed into an instrument case or an air data computer. That ram air pushes against a diaphragm, and air around that diaphragm is static air pumped in from a static port somewhere around the nose of the aircraft. The static air helps to calibrate how much the diaphragm is expanding and contracting as the air molecules from that ram air are pushing against that diaphragm to flex it. The amount that the diaphragm actually flexes is what's then displayed as indicated airspeed on your instrument face in your aircraft or up on your HUD on a more modern aircraft type. This is kind of the most simplistic airspeed readout, and it's basically what you use for your airspeed limits. Any published airspeed that you need to follow, such as an airspeed limit, like 250 knots while you're in the Marshall stack above the carrier waiting to land, or flying a hold in IMC while you're waiting to perform a Case 3 landing or an ILS approach, you're going to want to use indicated airspeed. Indicated airspeed is also the airspeed type you're going to want to use if, say, ATC tells you to reduce your speed by 10 knots or increase your speed by 10 knots, for example. Also, other published airspeeds such as stall speeds, corner speeds, things of that nature are also going to be in indicated airspeed. So usually that is why we tend to use indicated airspeed for most of the things we need to do in DCS world. But there are certain advantages to taking a look at and using the other types of airspeed that you have displayed to you in the cockpit. Next, let's talk about ground speed. It is simply how fast your aircraft is traveling over the ground. So if you drew a straight line out of the belly of your jet right down to the ground, it's however fast that point is traveling right across the ground. Pretty simple. True airspeed is a little bit more complex, and we'll be able to take a look at how this interacts with indicated airspeed, ground speed, and Mach once we get into showing you guys how it interacts with the environment around you. Where from a very simplistic explanation, true airspeed is how fast the air molecules are flowing around your jet. So basically exactly how fast you're flowing through the air around you. This is different from indicated airspeed because indicated airspeed does not correct for air density. True airspeed corrects for air density, so that is why we see true airspeed increase and indicated airspeed decrease as we increase our altitude. Mach number is simply the ratio of how close we are to flying to the speed of sound. So we're currently just under 0.8 Mach, so we're roughly just under 80% of the speed of sound. This number, this ratio, comes from true airspeed, the exact airspeed of the flow of air molecules flowing across our aircraft. So now that we've defined these 4 different types of airspeeds, why don't we go ahead and hop into a couple other F-14s at different altitudes, and we'll see how these different airspeeds interact with each other, so that way we can get a better idea of how to use these airspeeds to our advantage while flying in DCS. Okay guys, here we are in our F-14 cruising over Abu Dhabi at 1,000 feet. We also know from looking at the weather report that we have a 20-knot headwind impeding our progress across the ground. We can see that our radar altimeter is showing right at 1,000 feet, whereas our barometric altimeter is showing just below 1,000 feet. That is well within the acceptable margin of error of 75 feet plus or minus, and so we can go ahead and use this altitude for our demonstration. We can see if we zoom in on our airspeed indicator, the inside of the instrument face showing our indicated airspeed is showing us right at 450 knots indicated. Now, we spawned into this aircraft with a ground speed on the air start set to 430 knots. We can also see that it's giving us just below 70% of Mach 1, with a Mach of 0.69. If we look down at our HSD, we can see our ground speed readout at just under that 430 knot ground speed that we set in the mission editor. And we can see that our TAS is 466 as opposed to the 450 knots of our indicated airspeed. The fact that our indicated airspeed and our true airspeed do not match up even at this lowest altitude proves the rule of thumb idea that true airspeed will increase at a rate of 2% of your indicated airspeed every 1,000 feet you increase your altitude. So that seems to hold true now. 473 knots now is roughly about 2% of 455 knots indicated. We can also see that our indicated airspeed is roughly about 20 knots faster than our ground speed, and that is displaying to us the fact that we do in fact have that 20 knot headwind impeding our progress across the ground. So let's go ahead and hop into another F-14 up at a much higher altitude of 15,000 feet and take a look at how these different metrics measuring our airspeed compare against each other at that altitude. Okay guys, now we're in an F-14 cruising at just under 15,000 feet over the Emirati Desert. Looking at the weather report, we still have a 20 knot headwind, and in the mission editor, this air start was also set to start with a ground speed of 430 knots. So let's go ahead and take a look at how the different types of airspeeds are now interacting with each other and talk about why. So if we zoom in on our airspeed indicator, we can see we're currently just above 350 knots of indicated airspeed, with our Mach meter showing us right at about 0.7 Mach, or just above 0.7 Mach, so roughly about 70% of Mach 1. If we look down at our ground speed, we can see our ground speed's definitely right at 430 knots of ground speed, with our true airspeed being 451 knots. So we can see that at the ground speed of 430 knots, at an altitude of roughly about 15,000 feet, but just under at 14.5, we have a reduction in indicated airspeed of almost 100 knots. Now, at this altitude, we can see that using our indicated airspeed is no longer reliable for determining what our headwind is. We must use true airspeed, because we can see our true airspeed is only 20 knots above our ground speed, which, if we subtract those two numbers, gives us 20, which is right aligned with our known headwind in the weather report. So why is this happening? Well, there's a pretty simple explanation as to what is going on here with our indicated airspeed. As we stated earlier when we talked about the simple definition of how indicated airspeed is displayed to the pilot, that air flowing into the pitot tubes arrayed around the nose of our F-14 is then flowing into the diaphragm in the instrument case of our airspeed indicator. That indicated airspeed is not corrected for air density, so as we go up in altitude, the air density lowers and lowers and lowers. Therefore, there's not as many molecules of air flowing into the actual pitot tube itself, and then fewer molecules means that diaphragm is not going to be expanded nearly as much, because there just isn't that volume of air to actually keep pushing that diaphragm outwards to then move the needle for our indicated airspeed. So that's why indicated airspeed goes down. So this also gets into why the F-14 Tomcat and the engineering behind the KDEC, or Central Air Data Computer, that controls the wing sweep is so cool and so interesting, is because that KDEC takes into effect true airspeed, air density, air temperature, all these different things to move the wings to the correct position. So at this altitude, it's much better to get a bead on the environmental factors affecting your aircraft by using the true airspeed and ground speed that is actually shown on your HSD down here. When you're flying in formation with wingmen, it's much more efficient to go ahead and use a Mach number from your Mach meter to actually adjust your airspeed in reference to your wingman or your leader. This is something that I'm definitely guilty of, as I tend to go ahead and default back to using indicated airspeed, but different calibration errors and installation errors between two different aircraft can actually lead to you having issues with trying to sync up your indicated airspeeds, especially at higher and higher altitudes. This is also where you get into certain new types of airspeed, such as calibrated airspeed. It's something we don't really need to worry about in DCS world too much, but calibrated airspeed is your indicated airspeed then corrected mathematically for various different installation errors via the maintainers or any other personnel, or even the factory workers who built the aircraft installing that particular airspeed indicator. So let's go ahead and look at an even more extreme example. Let's jump up to an F-14 at 30,000 feet. Alrighty guys, we're back in the office of our F-14 Tomcat. This time we're way up at 30,000 feet, or just under 30,000 feet for this air start. The parameters for our air start in the mission editor are exactly the same, starting at 430 knots of ground speed, which is the default for the F-14 Tomcat, as well as a bunch of the other modern fighters in DCS world. And we still have the same weather report of a 20-knot headwind impeding our progress across the ground. So let's see how our airspeeds have changed. If we zoom in on our airspeed indicator, we can see for the indicated airspeed on the inside of the face of our instrument, we have 275 knots of indicated airspeed. Interestingly, we can see the Mach meter has also shifted, giving us roughly about 0.75 Mach, or 75% of the speed of sound, which is very different from the 0.7 Mach that we had down at roughly about 15,000 feet. So that's very, very interesting, and we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. Down on our HSD, we can see our ground speed right at 430 knots, and our true airspeed right at 450 knots, just under 450 knots that is. And we can see that once again, our true airspeed versus our ground speed is what we're going to want to do to look at the environmental factors influencing our flight path. Indicated airspeed is no longer good, so true airspeed subtracted by ground speed gives us roughly about 20 knots of headwind impeding our progress. Of course, as we know, true airspeed is the actual speed of the air molecules flowing over the surfaces of our aircraft. And the Mach number up here on our Mach meter on the outside of the ASI is very, very interesting. As I'm sure some of you guys know out there, but the speed of sound actually changes based off of the density of the fluid at which those sound waves are traveling through. And yes, air is in fact a fluid. If you're underwater scuba diving and somebody takes a clip and starts banging that metal clip against their scuba tank, that pinging sound is going to come to your ears extremely fast because the energy of those sound waves like to travel through more dense fluid. The higher you go and the less dense the fluid around you is, the slower the speed of sound goes. The energy of those sound waves can't travel as fast through a lower density fluid. So as we go up and up and up and up in the atmosphere, the speed of sound comes down, 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 down. We can also see from our readouts of our different airspeeds that true airspeed and our indicated airspeed, and that rule of thumb that every 1,000 feet true airspeed increases 2% over indicated airspeed, is in fact true. If we take our altitude of 30,000 feet and subtract that by the 1,000 feet we had 29,000 feet of altitude difference. If we multiply that by 2, that gives us roughly about 58,000 feet. And we can see that that is almost a 58% difference between our indicated airspeed and our true airspeed. So that was definitely some complex math, but basically all you need to know is that as you go up, 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 up in the atmosphere, your indicated airspeed goes down, 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 and your true airspeed goes up, 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 up. Your true airspeed is a better indicator of exactly how fast you're traveling through the air. Your Mach number shows exactly how fast you're going in comparison to the speed of sound, and your ground speed shows you exactly how fast you're traveling across the ground. However, that begs the question, why do we still look at the indicated airspeed when we're maneuvering the aircraft at a higher altitude? Well, there's a couple reasons for this, but mainly the fact that we're up way high in the atmosphere means that there's less air molecules in the air around us. Therefore, even though we're flying at a true airspeed of the air molecules flowing around us at about 440 knots, the air molecules aren't supporting us or giving us nearly as much lift as they would be down at sea level. So therefore, even though we're up at 30,000 feet, the aircraft would be behaving in the maneuvering sense as if we were down at sea level, but at 275 knots. So that's why those published airspeeds for things like stall speeds as well as maneuvering speeds are the same whether you're at sea level or you're up at 30,000 feet. Now, as we get faster and faster and faster, and we get up closer and closer and closer to the speed of sound, regardless of how fast the speed of sound is, it's going to start creating shock waves on the airframe of our aircraft. Those shock waves then create burbles and separation of the airflow of the boundary layer across our wings and across our fuselage. This can then create issues such as Mach tuck as those shock waves move further aft on our aircraft as the airspeed increases through the air, as well as the fact that as we get higher and higher and higher and higher and higher, we're going to reach a point where there's not going to be enough air molecules flowing over our aircraft to actually support us up in the air. This is why, say, when you bank your aircraft in DCS world, when you're flying very, very high up in the atmosphere, you tend to lose a lot of altitude, because as you bank your aircraft, you're splitting your lift into vertical and horizontal components of lift, and there's no longer enough air to support your vertical component of lift to keep you up at altitude. This is why you have to make very gentle turns when you're way up in the atmosphere. So this leads us back to why the F-14 is so cool, and the fact that the CADEC, or Central Air Data Computer, that controls the wing sweep really comes into play here. It decides based upon the air density, your altitude, your airspeed, all these kinds of things, where the wings should be. Of course, we know that swept wings are great for flying really fast, so that way we can split the airflow into chord-wise and span-wise flow. However, in the F-14, if we're going up really fast and we're up at a high altitude and we're going really fast, the wings may stay out further than they would if we were down at sea level. This is because the air data computer in the F-14 knows that the air density is so low up here that even though we're going fast, it's going to behoove us to have less of a wing sweep on the aircraft itself. I always find this stuff very interesting, and I hope you guys learned something about these different airspeed types, how they interact with each other, and when you should use them when you're flying your aircraft in DCS world, whether you're flying around for fun, having a training sortie, or you're flying in a serious combat mission. So, if you liked the video, please give us a like and a subscribe, and thanks for nerding out on this stuff with me. I really like talking about this stuff, and we'll see you in the next one. Fly safe and stay healthy, guys. And this is a little demonstration here. We can see that as we bank the aircraft up at this high altitude, the nose will start to drop rather quickly, and we can see on our VSI there that the aircraft is now descending quite quickly. And that's part of one of the reasons why having variable sweep wings is also really awesome. So, we'll see you in the next one, guys.